Hello and welcome to EA 101 with me, Ryan Starr. Probably. Definitely. It's nice to have you at this video. What I'm going to talk about today? Well, check this out. What's on the EA, how the scoring works, what schools tend to want to see out of an EA score as well, and how to get the most out of your preparation. We're going to start by pitching you a fastball. All right. Try this problem on your own. Pause the video, give it a go, see how you would answer it. And once you've answered it, resume the video, and we're going to talk about how it's done. All right. So I'm assuming you paused. Otherwise, you just saw me sitting around looking awkward for a few seconds. It's fine either way. Happy to have you here. So this is a good example of the kind of problem you're going to see on the EA. Now, you may not see this exact look for a problem where you have D sub E and T sub F and stuff like that. That is pretty particular to this problem, though it's not isolated to this problem. But what you will see is problems in which you're given a lot of information up front, bunch of answer choices. You'll often have to choose more than one answer, as is the case for this two-part question. And you'll have to get every part right to get credit for it. That's going to be the EA experience, especially in the IR section. What's the IR section, you ask? Well, you're going to have to wait to find out. Let's talk about this problem real quick, and then we'll talk about how it fits into the IR section and all that jazz. So first, what is this thing testing? It's testing the concept of correlation, right? There's a hypothesis that areas of the dorsal fin and tail fins of adult fish of this species are positively correlated. And we're asked in the answers, in choosing answers, to find an answer that supports this hypothesis and an answer that undermines this hypothesis. So that in turn means something that shows a positive correlation, kind of corroborates the positive correlation. And on the other hand, something that goes against the positive correlation, maybe by being flat, but maybe by being a negative correlation. First, look at the data. Where is there a positive correlation? Why have these biologists, this biologist, hypothesized that there's a positive correlation? Well, if you look at the dorsal fin area, D, and the tail fin area, T, what you'll notice, especially if you go from least to greatest, is the least dorsal fin area of 2 is paired with the least tail fin area of 3. Next, dorsal fin area of 3, tail fin area of 4. Next, dorsal fin area of 4, tail fin area of 5. So as one goes up, as dorsal fin area goes up, tail fin area goes up as well. That's the positive correlation this biologist is noticing. And that's serving as the basis of the biologist's hypothesis. Now, we want just one answer here that best supports that hypothesis. So an answer that shows as the dorsal fin area goes up, the tail fin area also goes up. A lot of these dorsal fin areas we've already seen in the data that's already available. 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all kind of replicated down here in these 4 new species of fish. Things aren't looking so good, though, for the tail fin area, right? Where the original data for a dorsal fin area of 2 had a tail fin area of 3. This one's got a tail fin area that's a little smaller, just kind of flat, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. Certainly doesn't support a positive correlation. Doesn't necessarily undermine it either, but it's not looking great. If anything, it undermines it, but not as much as, say, a dorsal fin area of 4 and a tail fin area of 2. So far, out of all the data points we've looked at, we've seen a lot in which the tail fin area is greater than the dorsal fin area, and now a couple in which they're equal. This is the only one so far in which the tail fin area is smaller than the dorsal fin area. And that is a really, really good sign that this one's going to undermine this whole positive correlation thing. It goes a totally different direction. Tail fin gets smaller as dorsal fin gets bigger. Fourth answer choice is a lot like the first two, and so it's going to be hard to choose like this one over either of those two, or vice versa. The last answer choice has now a dorsal fin area bigger than any of the ones we saw here, but also a correspondingly higher tail fin area. Continuing that positive correlation, this thing would fit pretty admirably with this data up here. So that's our supports. Now, you might have noticed we had to kind of go down the answer choices one by one. There's no real way to predict an answer here. You can kind of predict the shape the answer is going to take. A positive correlation will have tail fin area continuing to be bigger than dorsal fin area. A negative correlation would have the opposite. But you can't predict the exact numbers. You kind of have to take the answers on a case-by-case basis. Notice also, there's not a lot of real math involved there, though correlation is often learned as a mathematical concept. This one's more about logic. As long as you know mathematically what a positive correlation is, what you're really being asked to do is compare the answer choices to one another and to the data up there. You're also being asked to tie supporting the biologist's hypothesis with supporting a positive correlation with, in turn, seeing as one grows, the other grows. That kind of logical linkage is what a test like the executive assessment is all about. Questions? Just kidding. You're not here to ask them, or I'm not here to answer them. Either way, just kidding. All right, so what's on the EA? Basically, the EA will tell you what's on the EA is executive reason. All right, they are asking you to use some, I don't want to say simple math skills, but definitely math skills you have in all likelihood been exposed to at some point around maybe 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade. Some basic-ish grammar skills, and answer these reasoning puzzles using those skills, okay? And you're fully aware that part of the challenge is going to be relearning the math. That's something everybody has to go through. See me again in how to get the most out of your preparation. But know going into this test that the math is just the first hurdle if the quant section is what you're worried about. Beyond that, there's the reasoning aspect of it, all right? We just saw a good example of that there. Same on the verbal side. The grammar is just the first battle on sentence correction, but then there's the comparing of answer choices to each other, the interpretation of differences in the answer choices into what they mean, and things of that nature. Okay, so what's on the EA fundamentally? Reasoning questions, a bunch of logic questions, sometimes with a very distinctly mathematical flavor, sometimes with a very distinctly verbal flavor, but always logic questions. But more on that. What's actually on the EA? So the EA has 3 sections, but each section is subdivided into 2 halves. So it's going to seem when you're taking the EA as though there are 6 sections. More on this in a couple of minutes. There will be a good graphic explaining how the 2 can be true. But think of it as there are 3 kinds of sections. There's an integrated reasoning section, always comes first, your first 12 questions. There is a verbal section, 14 questions, always comes second, no break in between the 2 sections. And similarly, no break between the verbal section and the very last section, the quant section, okay? If you're under standard timing, you're looking at a 90-minute test because, again, there's no real pause. You just kind of go straight through from one section to the other. You can finish earlier. If you finish the section early and decide to just go on to the next section, that's totally fine. But know that there are going to be no like carryover minutes from one section to the other. That is, if you finish the integrated reasoning section at minute 27, you've got 3 minutes left over, your 2 choices are either just go straight to the verbal section and never see those 3 minutes again, or sit there for 3 minutes, maybe give yourself a little mini break, and then let the test kind of naturally whisk you on to the verbal section. Okay. Now, in the IR section, there are 4 question types. And the integrated reasoning section both comes first and is called the integrated reasoning section because it tests a mixture of math and verbal skills. A lot of what people struggle with in the integrated reasoning section, myself included, are the verbal challenges, the word tricks, the traps that they lay for you that way. But there are definitely plenty of math skills tested, from algebraic translations and correlations to averages and medians, percents, ratios, fraction skills, overlapping sets. Just about anything can come up, even combinatorics and probability on occasion. Okay, so any of the topics tested in quant can come up in the integrated reasoning section, though the major topics that are going to be tested there math-wise are ratios, percents, statistics. Okay, ratios, percents, statistics are the 3 areas you cannot at all forego if you want to do well in the IR section and honestly in the quant section. There are going to be more skills you really need to bring to bear for the quant section, but for the IR section, those three topics are likely on any given test the most powerful tools you have. Okay. There are multi-part problems. We just saw an example of that with the two-part question that we started with. That's one of the 4 question types on the integrated reasoning section. And as I mentioned there, and as I'll mention again, doom and gloom, no partial credit. All right, you get one column right, but the other column wrong. Sorry, you lose. The reason they do that is that usually in a multi-part question, one part is harder than the other part or other parts. And that's the one they're really testing you, right? I see students all the time taking the practice tests from the EA people, and when they miss one of these multi-part questions, by and large, they miss it on the exact same part. There's a part that is much more challenging usually. Okay, so be aware of that. That's what's really happening in the problems. You may not know which one is the most challenging part as you're looking at it, but if you're reviewing a test, if you're reviewing practice problems and you're feeling kind of down because it's like, man, I got 2 out of 3 parts right. Why can't they just give me some partial credit? That's the logic behind it. Not to defend them too much. Sure, they're terrible people. All right. There's going to be a lot of real world data presentations, real world stories, and information. There was a passage about ants in the official materials, I believe anyway, fire ants or some such. And it's a really harrowing passage, but it's a very real world passage. I myself have struggled with fire ants. Could have used that passage, okay? They're going to be very real world numbers as well on the integrated reasoning section, which is a little bit different from what you'll see on the quant section, where the numbers are a lot more curated, okay? To balance that out, the test makers do give you access to an on-screen calculator during the integrated reasoning section to deal with those very real world, unwieldy numbers, basically. Verbal section is going to have 3 question types. Sentence correction, as already mentioned, tests grammar, but it also tests meaning, and meaning is the reasoning side of it. Your knowledge of grammar is going to inform your interpretation of what the sentence literally means. Your knowledge of the real world is going to inform what the sentence should mean. And then again, your knowledge of grammar is going to inform how you choose an answer that conveys that intended meaning or that logical meaning. Okay. One popular misconception I'm just going to dispel right now that a lot of people go into sentence correction with is that whatever the original sentence says meaning-wise, you've got to defer to that in the correct answer. That is, the correct answer has to basically be structured the same way as the original, convey the same meaning as the original. That is not at all the rule. The rule is, as long as the answer you choose conveys a logical, plausible, real-world meaning, it's doing its job, okay? So meaning is the reasoning side of it. Grammar is the technical side of it. In the same way that you need to know the rules of algebra for the quant section, but knowing just the rules of algebra won't necessarily help you with how to get started on one of those problems, how to deal with the traps or tricks built into them and things like that. Okay. There's also going to be reading comprehension on the verbal section. It's usually, in fact, always in the first half of the verbal section. 4 questions, 1 long passage, and it's basically an open book test because the right answer on reading comprehension always comes from the passage. Always. Even when a question's asking you what can be inferred from the passage and it seems like, yeah, there's some room for interpretation there, there's not. The right answer has to be justified by stuff you can point to in the passage. However, those inference questions are where the reasoning aspect comes into reading comprehension, because again, it's a reasoning test, right? So it's not that they're just asking you straight up to report on what's in the passage. It's that the right answer might paraphrase what's in the passage, or in the case of inference questions, might take what's said in the passage and say the same thing in reverse, or might combine this one thing said in the passage with this other thing said in the passage about the same stuff into one statement. All right, so there's going to be some logic applied to what's said in the passage going into the correct answer, especially in inference questions and especially in purpose questions. That's how reasoning makes its way there. And then there's critical reasoning. Enough said. Basically, you're going to be getting short passages of bad arguments that are deliberately flawed, that deliberately leave important information out. And you're going to usually have to find the assumption in those arguments or think about what kind of new information would strengthen or weaken those arguments given the gaps in those arguments. What would kind of exploit the gap, that's missing information from the argument. Okay. A lot of reasoning in that. There are going to be about 4 of those questions as well. Sentence correction accounts for about 6 questions on the verbal section. And it's therefore pretty important to do well in. However, if you do well in reading comprehension and critical reasoning both, you can afford to just do half in sentence correction and still get a decent, if not good, verbal score. Font has 2 question types. Same as the 2 question types that used to be on the GMAT. Problem solving and data sufficiency. Okay. The topics tested are the same topics we mentioned for integrated reasoning, statistics, percents, ratios, but also fractions, which do get pretty heavily tested in integrated reasoning and honestly are about the same thing as percents and ratios. Algebra as well, linear algebra above all. So first degree, first order equations, usually involving 2 variables, A and B, X and Y. A lot of word problems, if you translate them to algebra, turn into linear equations. And a lot of times they just give you a couple of linear equation questions. Every now and then a quadratic pops up. Certainly inequalities and formulas or functions are fair game. But the big stuff algebra-wise you're going to see will be algebraic translations and first order equations, systems of equations having to solve by substitution or stacking, that sort of thing. Other topics come up, like the whole gamut of GMAT topics, if you've studied for the GMAT at all, or GRE topics, if you've studied for that test at all, are available on the EA, with the exception of geometry. Geometry is one topic you don't have to worry about, but rate, time, distance problems and rate, time, work problems are there. Weighted average problems are there. Combinations and permutations can come up, but they're very rare. Exponents and square roots, divisibility, positives, negatives, lots of stuff can come up. And all that stuff does come up, but it's usually like 1 positives, negatives question, 1 divisibility question, whereas you're going to see usually multiple percent questions, multiple questions about averages and medians, stuff like that. Okay. Now, how do these sections break down? So if you're under standard timing, you've got 30 minutes basically for your first 2 sections, because as I mentioned before, each of those 3 sections is broken into 2 halves. So your 12-question integrated reasoning section that comes first is broken up into 1/2 of 6 questions of mixed difficulty, as you see there, and then a second half of 6 questions whose difficulty is determined by your performance on the first half. If you get all 6 of these problems right, or generally 5 of those 6 problems right, you'll get the harder second half. If you get 3 or 4 right, you usually get the medium second half. And if you get 0 to 2 right, even 0 to 3 right, in some cases, the easier second half. Why that matters is essentially your score is somewhat constrained by the difficulty of the half you get, but it's also going to be the case that you can afford to miss more or fewer questions depending on how difficult those questions are. Okay, so all 3 sections are scored on a scale of 2 to 18 points. You miss nothing, you get all 18 of those points. But if you miss even 1 question, and this is particularly true in IR, you usually get docked multiple points. So on my first real EA, I missed 1 IR question, got a 15. And I've seen people on the official EA practice tests get 1 question wrong on IR and be bumped all the way down to a 13 or a 12. I've also heard of people getting 16 or 14 on IR. What determines whether you're getting 1 question wrong and going down from 18 to 16, or getting 1 question wrong and going down from 18 to 12? The difficulty of the question, right? If it's an easy question, you might dip down to 13 or 12. If it's a harder question, you're going to dip down to 16, maybe 15, something like that. And so you want to qualify for the harder second half, ideally, because 1, if you're aiming for that 18, which no school needs to see, but certainly is a lovely feather in your cap, you need to get the harder section to do it. But if you get the harder second section, you can also afford to get more questions wrong and still hope to come away with a decent score in the IR section. So if you miss nothing in the first half and get maybe 3 wrong in the second half, there's a good chance you come away from that with a 12, maybe an 11 in IR. Very respectable scores. Schools will be very happy with those scores. Every school I've ever heard of, anyway. Whereas if you miss one in the beginning, maybe let's say 2 in the beginning, right, and get the medium second half and miss one there, you might be looking at a 10 or even a 9 in the IR section, right? Now, these are somewhat speculative. It just depends on the difficulties of the questions. But if you land yourself in the medium or easier second half, the difficulty of the questions is lower. And so any questions you don't get to because, say, you run out of time, or any questions you happen to answer wrong are likely to cost you significantly more. Now, this gap between these two halves, you might wonder, what goes in that gap? Why is there a gap there? How does it play out on the real test? I wish I knew. I would tell you. No. What happens with this gap is you get to a review screen. All right. And this happens basically after every gap on the test. So you answer question 6, or just click next from it in some way. And you get to a screen that'll show you the status of those first 6 questions, namely whether you have left them incomplete or answered them, and whether you have marked them for review or not, because one of the functionalities you have throughout the test is the ability to mark a question. If you want to put in a guess on it and then come back to it if you have time, for instance, put in that guess, mark that question. And by the way, definitely guess on the test. There's no advantage to leaving questions blank. You will get them marked as wrong as if you'd guessed the worst answer out there. But if you guess, you at least have a chance of getting the question right. So definitely guess. But if you think, I could get this if I had some time, mark it for review, and you'll see on the review screen the questions that you've marked, and you can jump straight to them from that review screen. But that review screen is also where you're going to finalize those first 6 problems so that they can decide, okay, did this person in the end get them right or wrong? And what difficulty level should this person be given for the second half of the IR section? Once you finalize those first 6 problems on the review screen, you'll get this dire warning popping up saying, are you sure? Because you can never go back, and any you left incomplete, they're going to be marked incomplete. And you say, oh, I'm sure. And then on to the second half you go, and you'll never come back to those first 6 problems again. However, while you're in the first 6 problems, and while you're in this group, the second 6 problems, and throughout the test, you are able to move freely among the problems. You can answer one and then go to the next question, but then go immediately back to the one you just answered. You can leave one blank and come back to it later. You have a lot of flexibility in how you move through the test. Anybody coming over to the EA from the GMAT world will know that flexibility is precious. Anybody coming over to the EA from the GRE world is used to it. Nothing new here, nothing to see here, except that your second half of the section will be right after your first half of the section. All right. You do not have to get to the second review screen to get your questions, or your answers, I should say, tabulated for the second half of the section. What I'm saying is, so to tabulate your answers to the first half of the section, you do definitely have to affirmatively move on from the review screen. Otherwise, your time will just keep ticking down, and you'll eventually run out of it, never having seen the second half and getting all those questions marked wrong. So you have to kind of affirmatively move on to the second half of the section. Now, note, what I'm saying there is that the test is not going to move you on to the second half of the section at the 15-minute mark if you're under standard timing for the test. It'll happily let you spend all 30 minutes in the first 6 problems. You've got to move yourself on using this review screen and confirming on that review screen to the second half with enough time left to at least make a dent in the second half. Okay, so you're kind of on your own recognizance time-wise. And that's why it's a little bit misleading for the test makers to present it as 6 stages or 6 sections or subsections. They change the nomenclature from time to time because really you've got 30 minutes for the first 2 sections, because those first 2 sections are 2 halves of the one integrated reasoning section. If you're under standard timing, you can also get accommodations, especially if you've had accommodations in the past, or if you've been diagnosed with any sort of learning difficulty or neurodivergence. Look up the executive assessment for test takers with accommodations. You can get 50% extra time, and so have 45 minutes for the first section, second section, third section, or even 100% extra time. Sometimes you'll even get some break time in there. Look into it if you know that benefit. Either way, you're going to have to move yourself on at a certain point. Now, that doesn't mean you have to move yourself on at minute 15. To some degree, it's pretty important that you get these first 6 questions of the integrated reasoning section correct. That costs a little bit of extra time just so you can dot your I's and cross your T's. Spend that little bit of extra time because there are going to be some easier questions there, some medium questions there. And again, if you miss any of those, it's going to be harmful to your score. Okay, so make sure you're careful on this first half, even if it costs a little bit of extra time. But if you are careful on this first half and you do spend a little bit of extra time there, you have to go into the second half with a plan. Let's say you go into the second half of the integrated reasoning section with 13 minutes left, and you've done practice tests, and historically you've done pretty well in the first half of the integrated reasoning section. You have good reason to suspect that you're going into that second half, and it's the harder second half. You got 13 minutes left for 6 hard questions. Now, that's not going to be enough time, especially if the first 6 mixed difficulty questions took you 17 of the 30 minutes, assuming standard time. So you've got to go into that second half of the IR section planning to probably really invest in about 3 or 4 of those 6 questions and just guess on 2 or 3 of them. And to do that well, you're going to have to know which questions are your bread and butter, which ones should you invest in because you usually get them right, and which ones are maybe not all that worthwhile to do. A lot of the logic-based questions, the kind of like pure or deductive logic questions, come in the second half of the section. A lot of people find those ones at the very least are time-consuming and often are both time-consuming and very difficult to get right. Those could be good skips. Either way, go in with a plan. Okay? Even if that plan is cutting yourself off at 15 minutes and making sure you have the full 15 or whatever for the second half. Now, if you get to question 10 in the second half and you suddenly run out of time, it shouldn't take you by surprise. There's a countdown timer on the screen all the time. Plus, they give you a 5-minute warning and they blink it at 1 minute left. They're giving you signals, hey, time's pretty scant, so that you can at least go ahead and put guesses into questions that you may not have time to actually get to and do, which I'd highly recommend. Let's just say, worst case scenario, you're on question 10, you run out of time. You never got to that second review screen, never asked them to finalize and tabulate your answers on those questions or anything like that. That is okay. It's not ideal. Again, ideally, you'd guess on questions 10, 11, and 12, and then go back and finish the time working on one of them more seriously. But questions 7, 8, and 9, which you've presumably already answered to that point, those are going to get tabulated. Your answers there are going to get counted, right or wrong. So you don't have to get to the second review screen. You don't have to finalize the second half of any of these sections to get those answers counted. The test will count whatever answers you've clicked on and clicked next on up to the point at which you run out of time. Right? Ideally, with practice, with studying, it's not going to happen. You won't be blindsided like that. And the practice tests are pretty good at replicating the test format. And they should be. They're made by the test makers. But weird things happen on test day. It can happen to anybody. Just know it's not the whole section that's gone as a result. Okay. After that, your performance on the entire integrated reasoning section is tabulated, beep, bop, boop, and a starting difficulty level for verbal is calculated, and that same starting difficulty level for quant is calculated. But your performance on that first half of verbal or that first half of quant will be what governed the difficulty level of the second half, governs the second half of verbal and second half of quant. Example. I had a person once who got a 6 on the integrated reasoning section, and so certainly qualified for the easier verbal and quant sections. So this is on the real exam. The person went on to score 18, a perfect score on the verbal section, which is to say, even though it seems from this very scary branching arrow as though integrated reasoning is exerting some serious influence on how the test is going to feel from then on, it's not really. All it's really influencing is how you need to approach the first half of quant and verbal. If historically you've been pretty strong on integrated reasoning section, you expect to get the harder first half of verbal and quant, and you can therefore afford to miss more questions in the first half because those questions are going to hurt your score less. But if that's part of your strategy, you got to take the second half where you're likely going to be bumped down to medium pretty seriously. If, however, like the vast majority of people, you're doing so-so on integrated reasoning, scoring, somewhere between 8 to 12, let's say, you're likely to be starting in the medium section on verbal and quant. And there again, it's going to be pretty important to take the first half seriously because you don't want to miss a medium question if you can avoid it. And certainly you don't want to miss one of the easier questions that's just going to sneak in with that medium on average question group. All right. So your historical performance on IR maybe affects how much care and how much time you want to devote to the first half of verbal and quant. But your scores in verbal and quant are still fairly insulated from anything you might have done on IR, especially if you don't strategize recklessly around those two sections. Now, as I mentioned, reading comprehension always comes in the first half of verbal, but other than that, the questions are all kind of scattered about randomly. Some CR, critical reasoning, that is, some sentence correction in the first half and second half, though on my last official exam, I got all my sentence corrections in the second half. That can happen, happens sometimes. No big thing. Same on quant. Problem solving and data sufficiency will all be kind of interspersed between the two halves coming at you at random, usually. Though I think I had a student once who said that they saw all their data sufficiencies in the second half of quant for whatever reason. Algorithms. Best not to ask questions. Now, implicit in these gaps, but I want to make it explicit now. Verbal and quant go the same way. They have review screens in these gaps. The review screens show the same things. And similarly, you don't have to get to the second review screens to get your questions tabulated. The biggest difference in verbal and quant, aside from the number of questions, which instead of 12, as in the IR section, is 14, is that you can afford to miss more questions usually in verbal and quant and still come away with a decent score. I've seen people on the official practice exams, for instance, missing 7 or even 8 questions in their verbal and quant sections and getting scores of 10, which are, again, pretty respectable scores, depending on the programs you're applying for. Not saying that that's typical. In fact, it usually happens when all 7 questions they miss are in the second half of the section, where again, the questions are going to be harder because that implies they got all the first half right, and each harder question you miss costs your score less. But it is possible, and that's in no way possible in my experience on the integrated reasoning section. You can't get the whole first half right and miss the whole second half in IR and hope to score a 10 or above. So scoring in verbal and quant is a little bit more generous than scoring in the integrated reasoning section. And it's a good thing in the case of quant because most schools really want to see a high score. Okay. Now, let's talk about scores. You're going to get your score right away if you've taken it in person. Like right after the quant section finishes, boom, on your screen will come your overall score and your 3 section scores. Your overall score, they say, is on a scale of 100 to 200 points, but it's practically on a scale of 126 to 174 points. 174 points being the best. And the way it's calculated from at least these scores is fairly simple. As I kind of hinted before, how these scores out of 18 are calculated is a little bit weird because there's a pretty steep drop off, even in verbal and quant, from 18. Like if you miss a single question in verbal and quant, you're usually dropping down to 16 or 15 or even 14, but that descent slows at around a 12. You miss a couple of questions, you're at a 12, but then you can miss a few more questions before you're at a 10. All right. Still, these scores from 2 to 18 are basically all added to 120 arbitrary baseline points to calculate your, or to give you the real score, the overall score. So if you get a 10, 10, 10, which is what a lot of executive programs are looking for out of applicants, you get 120 points plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, that's 150 points. And a lot of you may have heard 150 as the magic number, because again, the vast majority of executive programs are asking that 150 out of people. Now, that's not to say if you get below 150, you have no chance. You absolutely do. Talk to your schools. And it's not to say that every executive program or every profile will love/be suited to a 150 in an application. If your undergrad GPA was very low, if you don't have in any way a quantitative background or something, schools might be looking to your score here for evidence that you can do some of the more quantitative stuff that's going to be in the program, and so might be a little bit more demanding of your score. Also, certain executive programs, looking at you, Wharton and Booth, tend to want to see a 12 in quant, and certainly every other executive program will be overjoyed to see a 12 in quant. The higher the quant score, the better it plays. But 10, 10, 10 is well suited to most executive admissions bids. Okay. 10 in verbal, 11 in IR, 12 in quants is what Wharton often tells people that they want to see or higher. If you're using the executive assessment to apply to a part-time program, they often ask for scores more like 152, 153 or above. And again, they're especially looking to see if you can get that quant score even further than a 10, like an 11 or 12 or above. If you're using the EA to apply to full-time programs, then a 12 or above in quant starts becoming more necessary. Again, not totally necessary, but pretty necessary. They also tend to want to see scores of 155 or above. So again, schools will absolutely play ball with the right candidate if that right candidate doesn't have the ideal EA score. If they like you, if they like your, undergraduate transcripts, if you've done grad work or professional certifications or any other thing that kind of checks the academics box and they like you as a candidate, they're going to use that to your favor, to your advantage, and not necessarily hold a not great EA score against you. So I don't want you to hear 150 and think, well, I got 149. Guess I'm toast. No, not at all. It's just to let you know that if you ask the schools, most of them will tell you that, but a lot of them will also let you in with scores under that. And I've had many students get in with scores under 150 to very good programs, top programs. No breaks, as we know, available in person and online. So what I was saying before is that if you take it in person, you get your score right away at the end of the section. However, at the end of the quant section, if you take your exam online, you're going to have to wait a few days for the scores to arrive. They can take up to 1 week. I've only had that happen to like 1 or 2 people in the past. Usually it's 3-4 days, right? But still, most of my students at least say they prefer the in-person experience, and you do get the added bonus of getting a score right away. You're able to take it up to twice in person and twice online for a total of 10 times. Just kidding, it's 4. But you can't take it all 4 times in person or all 4 times online. It's got to be 2 and 2. Okay. And there are a lot of things worth knowing about that online experience. By the way, Nemo, hello. Didn't see you there. It's supposed to play a sound when people come. I was recording this as if nobody was here for a long time, and hopefully you've benefited some from it. But since you are here, feel free to ask questions, put them in the chat window or in, whatever you have at your disposal, get on the mic, anything like that. Just talking about how the test is scored and how that scoring affects things. Other logistics things about the test. You take the test, your score is valid for 5 years. That's not to say you necessarily want to apply with a 5-year-old score. Schools will often be a little bit like, are you sure about scores that are older than 4 years old? At least that's true on GMAT and GRE side. Maybe for the EA, it's not as big a thing. Honestly, the EA has not been around much longer than 5 years. It's been about 8 years or so. But still, your score is technically valid and can be sent to schools for up to 5 years. And so if you're not sure whether you want to go to business school, you're still in the decision-making process, you can study for any of these tests and have them on file for a while to send off if and when you decide. You have to wait 24 hours to retake the EA. The EA is actually the most generous in terms of retakes because you can retake them right away instead of having to wait, say, 16 days for the GMAT or 21 days, I think, for the GRE. Just 24 hours and boom, you can retake it. You can also reschedule it really freely up until the moment of your appointment. You can reschedule as many times as you need. You can reschedule free of charge. So it's very generous in terms of retakes. It's very generous in terms of rescheduling, but that generosity comes at a cost, and that cost is $350 US every time you want to take the test. We already know the scoring scale. We already know the calculator stuff, and we already know this, but wanted to show you the logistics there and further on the logistics side. Test center versus online. There is a lot of similarity between the test center versus online testing experience, and then again, there are a lot of differences. As I said before, most students I've had and talked to about their testing experience afterwards who've done it both ways prefer the test center experience. I think I've only had like one student who preferred the online experience. Um, if you take it at a test center, one, subject to availability. If you're in a big city, there are going to be tons of test centers. But if you're in a more rural area or in a country other than the US, test centers can be fewer and farther between. They are available usually somewhere in the general vicinity of at least major cities. Online, you can take, of course, from anywhere. You take it in a test center, you go there, you're going to get palm scan, checked in, you're going to have to sign some stuff saying you won't cheat. You'll be given a locker that you can put your items into. You're going to go to a testing room, whereupon you'll be palm scanned and checked in again. You'll often have to like roll up your sleeves, maybe brush your hair back behind your ears to show that you're not wearing any recording devices. They'll examine your glasses, they'll make you turn out your pockets, stuff like that. Feels like a pretty secure environment. And indeed, when you're in the testing room, there are going to be other people there. Usually you'll be partitioned off from each other, but there are going to be other people there taking their other tests, GMATs, professional certifications, stuff like that. There are going to be cameras trained on you, and there's going to be a proctor who just checked you in, second check-in, sitting outside, watching you on monitors, watching you through a big window, making sure everything's on the up and up. You're going to be given what we still call a yellow pad, but is often a pad of white or cream colored legal-sized grid or graph paper, spiral bound on a short end. So it's about 8.5 inches by 14 inches. I forget what the name for that size is in A terms, but I think it's A3. It's laminated. You can't really erase it with the marker that they give you. It's a like 0.7 millimeter fine tip felt pen that they give you to write on it with. And you're meant to just use it like normal pen and paper, just kind of go through the pad. Every now and then, at some test centers, students have told me they've gotten just one sheet of paper at a time, but usually it's 5 or 6 sheets spiral bound that you're given at the beginning of the test. Either way, if you fill up whatever scratch paper you're given, the proctor will bring you more. You'll just have to exchange it. Okay. However, if you take it online, and this is one of the biggest differences you'll notice, there you're allowed to do your scratch work only on a white board. It's got to be an actual board, and keep it as simple as possible. Just a flat white surface, ideally not even two-sided. Write on it with an erasable pen, erase it with an erasable marker. You're going to have to like write on it and erase it as you go through the test because you probably won't have room to do too many problems on it, given that its maximum size is only 12 by 20 inches. And most of the time, the closest you can find is like 12 by 16 inches. But you do have a physical whiteboard at your disposal, which you have to purchase on your own ahead of the test. They will not send you one. You also have an online whiteboard available to you, but it's not particularly good. Usually, what people report about the online testing experience is that they feel very seen or observed is probably a better way to put it. You're going to be on your webcam the entire time. They're going to be screen recording you the entire time and administering it through Zoom. And you have students worrying about like noises, maybe ruining things for them because the mic's going to be on the whole time. And maybe if a dog's barking outside, things will go bad. That's not been my experience. In fact, my dog barked outside last time I took an online exam and they said nothing to me. I even had a cell phone alarm going off during my last online exam and I couldn't touch my cell phone because that would have canceled my exam. But the alarm going off, I think, got me an administrative review, but ultimately they decided to accept my results. And so there are worries when you're taking it from home or whatever location you're doing the online exam about how much you can control the environment, both worries that you will probably have and worries that the test makers certainly have. But some of those worries are unfounded. Some of them are very well founded. If your internet, for instance, cuts out for a minute, probably no big deal. You might end up losing about a minute of test time behind that before it like shuts down because the person notices you're not there. But if you're back online in a minute, it'll be fine. But if your internet like totally crashes, then your test is basically forfeit at that point. If somebody walks into the room that you're testing in inadvertently, they will cancel your test immediately at that point. If you can't adequately block out your windows and they, during the security check, determine that you can't do so, they will cancel your test at that point. So there's a lot more about the kind of security procedures that feels worse with the online test because you're in your own environment and the test makers worry about test security. Okay. And that seems to be the thing that bothers students the most. Also, and this is very anecdotal, but a lot of my students say that the online test questions just feel harder than the in-person test questions. So all things to consider when you're deciding whether to take it in a test center or online. Now, the biggest advantage of the online test, aside from the fact that you can do it from anywhere, is you can do it at any time. 24/7, it's available. All right, it's the world over. Test centers, on the other hand, are usually only open Monday through Saturday in some countries, Sunday through Friday, Sunday through Thursday, Monday through Friday, depending on where you're at, and during normal business hours. So if you know that you do your best work at 1:30 a.m. on Tuesdays, the online test is going to be the way for you to really shine. But if you know you do your best work in a testing environment where other people are testing, again, not necessarily taking the same test you are, and certainly not on the same schedule. They'll be coming and going as you're taking your test. But if you know you do better in an environment like that, you've maybe done better in that kind of environment in past tests, university, in school, standardized tests, professional tests, whatever, the in-person testing option is likely going to be best for you. All right. Now, how do you prepare for the test? First, you've got to basically study the big topics. Okay. The big topics we mentioned before are algebra, statistics, percents, ratios, fractions, but also parallelism on the sentence correction side, comparisons, modifiers, things of that nature. Okay. You got to be good at reading comprehension as a skill. You got to be good at reading critical reasoning as a skill as well. And for the integrated reasoning stuff, being just comfortable with taking data from tables or graphs is kind of its own skill. There's going to be a couple of table questions, a few graph questions. This is stuff you're going to need. So just kind of exposure to the different topics and the different question types is going to be important. By that same token, data sufficiency as a question type needs its own special study, irrespective of whatever quant topics happen to be tested in any given data sufficiency problem. Data sufficiency problems test all the quant topics. You're going to see some data sufficiency story problems, some positive negative data sufficiency problems, some divisibility ones. Can be just about anything. But the major topics worth studying, I'm going to put a slide up for this real quick because I think it's worth seeing, are those ones. Now, studying those topics, as I mentioned well before, is just kind of the start of your EA journey, because the real challenge is going to be, once you know all those topics, once you're conversant in all those subjects, to deal with the trickiness and the reasoning in the questions. Here, by the way, is that slide. To deal with the reasoning in the questions, what makes a medium percents question different from a harder percents question or an easier percents question is sophistication of the question. Like, how many things are you given? In a medium question, you might be given 3 pieces of information. In a harder question, more like 4. In an easier question, more like 2. But it's also a question of the level of trickiness of the wording in the question. Percent questions are fertile ground for some of the best word traps that they have. And so a harder and a medium percent question might look basically identical to each other, but what's happening in the harder question is a subtle word trick that can easily slip by undetected. And you'll know it's a trap because if you don't pick up on the wording, you come to an answer that's wrong, that answer will still be among the answer choices. Okay, so the difficulty aspect of the test, how they toggle harder to medium to easier difficulty, has very little to do with the subjects tested and very much to do with how tricky or how complex the iterations on those subjects will be. These are the big subjects. These are by no means the only subjects get tested. Again, quadratics get tested, combinations and permutations get tested, probability gets tested, consecutive integer properties get tested, functions and sequences as well. But those all show up like 0 to 1 time on any given test. These topics on this list on the left side will tend to show up at least 1 time per test. And again, some of them show up multiple times per test. Modifiers, parallelism, comparisons tend to show up multiple times per test in sentence correction, as do idioms, though there's not a huge amount of studying if you do great idioms. And assumption-based questions in critical reasoning, detail-oriented questions. specific detail, inference about a detail, and purpose of a detail, especially. Questions come up in reading comprehension more than anything else. Primary purpose questions come up, I'd say about 50%. That is on 50% of tests. Right? That's the kind of stuff. Now, once you've got those topics well in hand, the next thing you're going to have to do is start practicing. And practicing takes a couple of forms depending on where you're at in your studying. So when you first learned a topic and are looking to master it, you are trying to do targeted practice on that topic. So if you've just been through, say, the exponents chapter of maybe a Manhattan Prep book, if you just watched an exponents lesson or something like that, for a while, you want to do some exponents practice. But you don't want to do all your exponents practice at once. Spaced repetition is actually key to long-term retention and development. You do the exponents lesson, the next day you do some exponents practice, maybe 5-6 problems. Then 2 days later, do a few more exponents problems, and then 2 days after that, a couple more exponents problems. Taper it off, but space it out as well. Gives your mind time to start forgetting it, and then when you come back to it, it basically takes root even more strongly than before. All right, spaced repetition of targeted practice is really important for any topic you have recently learned, and it's important to keep that going on like a low burner even for topics that are not as recently learned. So after you do that spaced kind of blitz repetition for exponents in this hypothetical scenario, in the weeks that ensue as you learn new topics, you still want to do 1 or 2 exponents problems every few days. You want to keep them in the rotation for a while. All right. And how you decide which topics to do in the beginning, you kind of want to do all topics. But after that, practice tests and practice problems will tell you. You see which ones you're struggling with by reviewing them carefully, noting where your struggle actually came, and you know, okay, I need to work a little bit harder on this. Later on in your studying, after you've been through kind of all the reading or all the lessons you're going to watch or all the classes you're going to attend or anything like that, you're going to use practice problems almost exclusively or practice tests to diagnose stuff, and you're going to use targeted practice after that to get better at it. You're usually not going to be going back to the books or going back and rewatching lessons, though everybody is different. Now, targeted practice needs to be balanced out with random practice. That can be in the form of a practice test, and it should be in the form of a practice test. And the more you can make your practice tests like dress rehearsals for the actual tests, the better. So take them at the same time of day, on the same time of the week. Try to go through whatever your routine that day is going to be, whatever your routine on test day is going to be on the day of your practice tests and stuff like that. But testing can also take the form of random timed sets of practice questions, right? Really important that when you do random practice for the test, you do it timed. When you do targeted practice, it's a bit less important that you do it timed. It's much more important that you absorb stuff from each of the problems, get good takeaways that'll help you in that topic or with that problem type going forward. But you got to balance targeted practice out with random practice because time management is one of the most important aspects of the test, okay? They're testing your reasoning skills, and yes, they're testing your underlying math and grammar skills for sure. But time management is also huge. There's a reason they give you what they know to be a very limited amount of time to do all these sections. And that is they want to see if you can make wise investments with this limited resource that you have, time. Okay. Wise test takers don't try to do every single problem unless they know they can because they're going to be super fast on some problems. Instead, they know which problems are worth it for them, which problems aren't worth it for them, and make odds decisions about where to spend their time. This is not to say that you can't do every problem, even if you're approaching the test that way. It's a question of what you prioritize, what you make sure to do earlier on in your section versus what you kind of shunt to the end. Okay. Still, time management gets practiced in random sets, as does leaving questions behind, just foregoing them because they look like they're going to be too hard and stuff like that. So a big part of the reason you're taking practice tests and doing timed random practice is to get a sense for which those questions are, which are those questions that you should skip because they're not really to your advantage. In the beginning, you'll get that from review of the sets. In the end, you'll get that from just kind of like being able to spot the questions in the beginning, or from being good at planning so that you can see at the beginning of a problem, I don't have a plan for this one, and I usually have a plan for problems, that sort of thing. Okay. When it comes time to review targeted sets or practice sets, you need to commit to spending a lot of time on that. And this is the last thing I want to leave you with in terms of how to get the most out of your preparation. Spend at least twice as long reviewing problems as doing them. This should involve redoing the problems, right or wrong. I'd say redo the problems. If you got them right, try to get them right in a faster way using a different approach, that sort of thing. If you got them wrong, try to work your way to the right answer one more time before you go to the explanations, and do that untimed, which is why the review should take you at least twice as long. All right. Try to diagnose the issue that really went wrong in the problem, not just like, oh, guess I'm bad at percents problems, but it was a wording issue in this percent problem, or I put the number in the wrong place, or I estimated badly, or something like that. Because the more you can pinpoint what your actual issue was, the more you can come up with a takeaway that's going to redress that issue. And then you can practice that takeaway in subsequent problems and turn it into your new habit. And that is the goal of reviewing. Figure out exactly what your problems are and use those problems as a stepping stone to generate takeaways. Use those takeaways on future problems. You're never going to see on the real test a problem you've seen in the practice, but you're going to see problems that benefit from similar approaches, from, that are played with similar traps, that use similar wordings and things like that. And so taking away little bits and pieces of problems, getting broadly applicable takeaways from problems, that's going to be the important stuff. Don't go straight to explanations no matter what, okay? Do some analysis on the problem first, redo the problem. Even if it means you're like beating your head against the wall of the problem, you're really struggling with it, it's important, because what you're getting better at when you take time redoing a problem that you got wrong, you already got it wrong, and maybe you'll just get stuck again, is you're getting your brain better at coming up with a problem-solving process, right? Putting it in an environment in which it has to at least try to get around some obstacle before it in this problem. The more you do that, the more your brain's going to find a way. Just got to give it the opportunity to do so. By contrast, going straight to explanations is passive learning, and your brain doesn't necessarily have to get better at thinking its own way around the obstacles. Moreover, explanations are pretty tied to specific problems. And so an explanation you read for a problem will help you get that problem right, but not necessarily a future problem with a similar trick or a similar mistake that you could make or something like that. So when and if you do have to come to the explanations, don't just read them straight through top to finish, or you're not getting much out of them at all. Instead, read them piece by piece and see if, okay, having read this piece, now can I do it? Have I got the thing I needed? And that'll also help you know what the issue was in the problem, right? Because if you're like, oh, this piece did it for me, now I can proceed through the problem, then you know, okay, that was the thing that I was missing in the problem. How should I have seen that in the problem? How should I have known that that was the thing? That's going to help you get your takeaway, right? So if you have to come to the explanation, everybody does sometimes, and sometimes you just want to. Still, don't read it start to finish, okay? Good review is good studying. Good review is good studying. Good review takes a long time. Do not fall into the trap of thinking you've got to do as many problems as possible. You don't. You have to do each problem you do as completely as possible. You have to come away from a lot of them with good takeaways that'll help you in future problems, because you're using these problems to build your skills, not your memory bank of problems. Okay? With that, I want to let you all know that if you go to manhattanprep.com, you can get a free starter kit for any of the major tests. And if you want to sign up for a course, there's a discount code. How about that? Thank you so much for watching the video. It's a pleasure to teach you. Good luck with all of your EA preparation. That's it.